Introduction. The Strait of Hormuz. A narrow ribbon of water barely 21 miles wide, yet it serves as the jugular vein of the global economy. To the north lies the Islamic Republic of Iran, a nation fortified by the impenetrable Zagros Mountains and armed with a sprawling network of asymmetric warfare capabilities. It is a modern powder keg, a geopolitical flashpoint where a single miscalculation could ignite a conflagration unlike any seen in the 21st century. In a potential war with Iran, the complexities are staggering. This is not a theater for traditional, linear combat. It is a landscape defined by paradox. Hyper-advanced ballistic missiles and swarm drones deployed alongside shadowy, decentralized proxy militias. It is an arena of profound asymmetry, where multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier strike groups must navigate constricted waters seeded with cheap, deadly naval mines. The global economic stakes are almost unfathomable. A closure of the Gulf would choke off a fifth of the world's daily oil supply, plunging financial markets into freefall and fracturing international alliances. Politicians debate, analysts hypothesize, and generals run endless supercomputer simulations. Yet the sheer complexity of this theoretical conflict defies easy answers. How do we comprehend a war so technologically advanced, so deeply intertwined with global survival, and so politically fraught? To understand the wars of tomorrow, we must summon the ghosts of the past. Technology evolves, spears become muskets, and muskets become hypersonic cruise missiles, but the fundamental nature of war remains grimly unchanged. It is a contest of human will, subject to the same geographical constraints, psychological terrors, and political mandates that govern the battlefields of antiquity. Titans in the Gulf operates on a singular, audacious premise. What if we resurrected history's greatest military minds and placed them in a modern war room to solve this 21st century crisis? If we strip away the blinding glare of modern technology, what timeless truths would the masters of strategy reveal about a potential conflict in Iran? By analyzing this modern powder keg through the eyes of the past, we uncover strategies that algorithms simply cannot compute. To dissect this monumental challenge, we have summoned a cast of 3 titans. First, from the brutal campaigns of antiquity, we bring forth Julius Caesar. Caesar was a master of the impossible. Where others saw impenetrable defenses, Caesar saw an engineering challenge. He is the architect of unparalleled logistics and the ruthless executor of the divide and conquer doctrine. In the fractured political landscape of the Middle East, with its complex web of ethnic, religious, and tribal divides, Caesar's genius for exploiting internal fractures offers a brilliant, if ruthless, blueprint. His mastery of rapid, world-altering infrastructure, whether bridging the Rhine in days or walling off Alesia, shows us how to systematically dismantle an entrenched adversary. Second, from the battlefields of 19th century Europe, enters Napoleon Bonaparte. The emperor changed the very geometry of war. He possessed an insatiable appetite for speed, mobility, and the decisive battle. Napoleon did not fight to take territory. He fought to isolate and utterly annihilate the enemy's field army. Confronted with the vast, imposing Iranian plateau, Napoleon's doctrine of the corps d'armée, independent, self-sustaining units moving with lightning speed to converge at the critical moment, provides a fascinating counterpoint to the slow, methodical buildup of modern coalition warfare. Finally, to anchor these practitioners in cold, enduring reality, we turn to the philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz never conquered empires, but he conquered the theory of conflict itself. He gives us the vocabulary of war, the fog of war, the identification of the enemy's center of gravity, and the ever-present friction that causes the simplest plans to catastrophically fail. Most importantly, Clausewitz demands that we remember the ultimate truth. War is merely the continuation of politics by other means. In a conflict where a tactical victory could spell strategic and economic suicide, Clausewitz stands as the ultimate judge, forcing us to ask not just how to win, but why we are fighting at all. Together, these three titans will tear up the modern playbook. Prepare to view the future of war through the lens of history's greatest conquerors. Chapter 1: The Grand Strategy, Invading the Uninvadable. In the volatile and constantly shifting geopolitical landscape of the late modern era, where the skies are crisscrossed by the vapor trails of long-range ballistic missiles, and the air hums with the telemetry of precision-guided suicide drones, one strategic axiom remains remarkably durable. A large-scale ground invasion of the Islamic Republic of Iran is a military nightmare. While the theater of conflict has recently witnessed unprecedented levels of aerial and naval engagement, the prospect of placing foreign infantry onto Iranian soil remains fraught with an almost unimaginable level of operational peril. To understand why this is so, one must first look away from the arsenals of modern weaponry and gaze instead upon the primordial, unyielding forces of geology and geography. Iran is not merely a nation, it is a sprawling, naturally occurring citadel. Covering more than 630,000 square miles, an expanse larger than several major European nations combined, it is a vast, high plateau ringed by some of the most forbidding topography on the planet. It is home to more than 93 million people, and its sheer physical scale alone makes the prospect of territorial control an exercise in logistical hubris. To the west, facing the traditional invasion routes stretching from the plains of Mesopotamia, rise the mighty Zagros Mountains. This is not a single, easily bypassed ridge of stone. It is a colossal, 125-mile-wide belt of parallel, jagged ranges interspersed with high, restrictive plains that stretch for nearly 1,000 miles from the Turkish border in the northwest, down to the waters of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz in the south. The highest peak, Mount Dina, pierces the sky at over 14,000 feet, effectively turning the western frontier into an unbroken, towering fortress wall. Modern mechanized warfare, forged on the plains of Europe and the deserts of Arabia, relies fundamentally on speed, maneuverability, and secure, expansive lines of communication. Armored divisions require open terrain to mass their fires, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain their momentum. The Zagros Mountains deny all of this. Invading forces would be squeezed into narrow, predictable mountain passes where defenders possess an overwhelming high ground advantage. The terrain inherently favors lighter, more mobile defensive forces over heavy mechanized units that require extensive logistical tethers. Historical case studies from the United States Military Academy indicate that attacking forces in such vertically complex environments typically require force ratios of between 3-to-1 and 5-to-1, simply to dislodge entrenched defenders. If an invading army somehow manages to bleed its way through the Zagros, they are then confronted by the merciless, sun-baked interior. Central and eastern Iran are dominated by two of the most hostile deserts on Earth, the Dashti Kavir, or the Great Salt Desert, and the Dashti Lut. Baked beneath a blazing sun, the Dashti Lut is a colossal, 20,000 square mile expanse of sand, rock, and sweeping salt flats that stretches the endurance of organic life to its absolute limits. Here, the land surface temperature has been recorded at a staggering 159 degrees Fahrenheit, officially marking it as one of the hottest places on the globe. It is an unearthly, alien landscape defined by towering rock and clay formations known as calottes, immense, shifting sand dunes, and desolate stony pavements called hamadas. An army attempting to maneuver its mechanized columns through this anvil of the sun would find its equipment failing, its water supplies evaporating, and its soldiers succumbing to the brutal elements long before they ever encountered enemy fire. Historically, this geography has served as Iran's primary savior. While the Iranian plateau has been conquered, it is a remarkably rare occurrence. Alexander the Great managed it from the west, as did the Arab armies in the 7th century, while the Mongols swept in from the more open eastern steppes. But in modern times, the terrain has acted as a grinding stone for ambitious conquerors. During the devastating Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, Saddam Hussein's armored columns launched a surprise invasion, only to be quickly bogged down and bled dry by the difficult terrain of the Zagros Mountains, which rendered their superior armor largely useless in the narrow defiles. Furthermore, this vastness provides the regime in Tehran with unparalleled strategic depth. It allows the Iranian military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to disperse their nuclear, ballistic missile, and drone infrastructure deep into subterranean mountain complexes, making them exceptionally difficult to obliterate with air power alone. The nation's defense is not purely centralized. It is organized into multiple, regional, and semi-independent layers designed to absorb, delay, and bleed an invader in a drawn-out war of attrition. How, then, does a military mind approach the overarching theater of a modern Iranian conflict? If the traditional doctrine of overwhelming mechanized force and rapid dominance is neutralized by the Zagros and the Dashti-Lut, how would the great captains of military history deconstruct this problem? By summoning the strategic philosophies of Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Karl von Clausewitz, we can view the Iranian fortress through 3 distinct, brilliant, and unsparing lenses. Act I, Julius Caesar and the engineering of conquest. If the command of a modern coalition force were handed to Gaius Julius Caesar, the Roman general would not immediately order his armored columns into the fatal funnels of the Zagros Mountains. Caesar was a man of supreme, calculating patience. He was an architect of war who understood that the foundation of any successful conquest lay not in the immediate clash of swords, but in logistics, infrastructure, and the ruthless, methodical exploitation of his enemies' internal political fractures. Caesar's legendary campaign in Gaul between 58 and 50 before Christ offers the blueprint for his strategic approach. When Caesar entered Gaul, he did not face a unified nation, but rather a patchwork of squabbling tribes, the Aedui, the Arverni, the Helvetii, and the Nervii. He brilliantly portrayed his invasion as a preemptive and defensive action, selectively allying with certain tribes to destroy others, leveraging diplomacy and internal division as a weapon just as lethal as his veteran legions. Looking at a demographic map of Iran in the modern day, Caesar would instantly recognize a deeply fractured society masquerading as a monolith. Iran is a multi-ethnic state suffering from a profound constitutional identity crisis, one that has persisted for over a century. While the ruling apparatus in Tehran projects a unified Persian and Shia Islamic identity, nearly 40% of the population speaks a mother tongue other than Persian. Caesar would note the precise demographic breakdown with a predator's eye. Persians make up roughly 61% of the population, followed by Azerbaijani Turks at 16%, Kurds at 10%, Lurs at 6%, and smaller communities of Arabs and Baloch at roughly 2% each. More importantly, Caesar would recognize the strategic geography of these minorities. They are predominantly clustered along the volatile border regions, in direct contact with ethnic kin in neighboring states like Azerbaijan, Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan. This creates transborder continuity and the constant, simmering potential for territorial fragmentation. The regime has long treated these peripheral regions, Iranian Kurdistan in the west, Arab Khuzestan in the southwest, and Sistan and Balochistan in the southeast, as acute internal security threats. They are underdeveloped, culturally suppressed, and economically marginalized. Caesar would see the domestic fallout following the catastrophic 12-day war of 2025 as his primary vector of attack. The aftermath of that conflict plunged the Islamic Republic into a severe crisis of legitimacy, triggering massive economic instability, nationwide mass protests, and a violent state crackdown. Execution numbers from late 2025 paint a grim, bloody picture of this center-periphery war. 506 Persians, 264 Kurds, 239 Lurs, 164 Azeris, and 142 Baloch were executed by the state, alongside thousands of arbitrary detentions. The state's heavy-handed repression, fueled by a fear of civil disobedience and foreign interference, has alienated vast swaths of its own populace. To Caesar, these marginalized and brutalized groups are the modern equivalent of the Gallic tribes, waiting to be turned against their overlords. He would immediately establish clandestine contact with the Mobarizon Popular Front, a newly formed coalition of Baloch organizations in southeastern Iran. This front, which absorbed the battle-hardened Salafi jihadi group Jaish al-Adl, has initiated a localized uprising in Sistan and Balochistan, framing their fight not just as civil unrest, but as an organized sectarian war against the Shia regime. Their very name, Mobarizon, references the elite duelists from the dawn of Islamic history, a direct challenge to the regime's religious legitimacy. Caesar would covertly supply the Mobarizon Popular Front, the Kurdish opposition groups in the Zagros, and the Arab separatists in Khuzestan with arms, funding, and actionable intelligence. He would stretch the Iranian security apparatus to its breaking point, forcing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to shift its elite forces away from the external borders to pacify internal rebellions. He would divide and conquer, perfectly content to let the Iranians bleed one another before committing his own heavy forces. While his proxy forces ignited the periphery, Caesar's conventional forces would focus entirely on logistics and infrastructure. In antiquity, the Roman war machine was defined by its unparalleled ability to build its way to victory. During his Gallic campaigns, Caesar relied heavily on establishing undeniable supply chains, gathering grain from allied tribes, and ensuring his men and horses were fed before committing them to battle. As Caesar himself dictated, it is by proper maintenance of supplies that armies are kept together. Caesar would scoff at the idea of pushing deep into the Iranian plateau without a heavily fortified logistical tail. He would secure the critical geographical chokepoints, most notably the Paytak Pass, historically known as the Gates of Zagros, which serves as a primary conduit from the Mesopotamian plains into the Iranian interior. Rather than rushing blindly through the pass into an ambush, Caesar would order his combat engineers to transform it into an impregnable bridgehead. He would construct sprawling, fortified forward operating bases, expanding airfields, hardening fuel depots, and laying down robust, multi-layered ground lines of communication. We can see the reflection of this mindset in Caesar's legendary siege of Alesia in 52 before Christ. Trapped between a fortified Gallic city containing 80,000 warriors under Vercingetorix and an incoming relief force of 250,000 Gauls, Caesar did not panic, nor did he retreat. He constructed an 11-mile inner wall of circumvallation to keep Vercingetorix trapped inside, and a 14-mile outer wall of contravallation to hold off the relief army. He diverted rivers, dug massive trench systems, and seeded the ground with traps. Caesar won not just through martial prowess, but through superior engineering, starvation, and iron discipline. Applied to a modern Iranian campaign, Caesar would use air power, massed indirect artillery fire, and combat engineering to isolate Iranian forces within their mountain strongholds. If elements of the Revolutionary Guard entrenched themselves in a fortified subterranean bunker complex, Caesar would not waste his infantry in costly, bloody frontal assaults into the dark. He would besiege them. He would utilize modern combat engineering to sever their physical supply lines, collapse their ventilation shafts, and cut their fiber optic communications, starving them out just as he starved out Vercingetorix. His invasion of Iran would be a slow, methodical, and agonizing constriction, a python wrapping itself around the Zagros Mountains, perfectly content to wait while internal ethnic strife and logistical strangulation brought the regime to its knees. Act II, Napoleon Bonaparte and the mirage of the decisive battle. If Julius Caesar's approach is the slow constriction of a python, Napoleon Bonaparte's strategy is the sudden, violent strike of a cobra. The French emperor possessed a fundamentally different temperament than the Roman dictator. Napoleon despised slow, methodical wars of attrition and the painstaking mechanics of siege warfare. He lived for speed, for audacious maneuver, and for the thunderbolt of a massive, decisive engagement that shatters the enemy's primary fighting force in a single afternoon. Were Napoleon standing before a map of the modern Middle East, he would unroll it upon the floor, drop to his knees, and begin placing wax-tipped pins with manic intensity, just as he did prior to the Battle of Marengo. To Napoleon, the formidable Zagros Mountains and the sweeping, lethal deserts would not be viewed merely as insurmountable obstacles. They would be incorporated into his grand strategy of the central position. Napoleon revolutionized warfare by dividing the French army into autonomous corps, capable of marching independently but concentrating rapidly for battle. This allowed his forces to move with unprecedented speed, living off the land and outmarching slower, supply-heavy adversaries. Faced with the mountainous terrain of western Iran, Napoleon would utilize the Zagros not as a barrier to halt his advance, but as a vast curtain of maneuver. He would likely detach a smaller, highly visible fixing force to launch a noisy, frontal feint against the heavily defended mountain passes. This would be designed to draw the attention and the mass of the conventional Iranian military, known as the Artesh. The Artesh is largely a conscript force, oriented toward territorial defense and bound by more traditional, rigid command structures. Napoleon would dismiss them as a secondary concern. While the Artesh mobilized to meet the feint, Napoleon would lead the bulk of his forces on a swift, wide strategic envelopment. He would navigate lesser-known routes, operating behind thick screens of cavalry, or, in modern terms, armored reconnaissance and electronic warfare jamming, to completely bypass the Iranian defensive line. His ultimate goal would be to force a decisive battle. In every major campaign, from Austerlitz, where he annihilated the Austro-Russian forces, to Wagram and Borodino, Napoleon sought to find the enemy's center of gravity on the battlefield and smash it with concentrated artillery and massed infantry. In Iran, Napoleon would identify the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the true center of military and political power. The Revolutionary Guard is an ideologically driven force, volunteering to defend the revolution and holding a far higher standing within the Iranian hierarchy than the regular Artesh. They control the ballistic missiles, the asymmetric proxy networks, and the formidable economic levers of the state. Napoleon would view the Guard in much the same way he viewed the Mamelukes during his Egyptian campaign of 1798, as a fanatical, elite warrior caste that must be drawn into the open and destroyed. Napoleon's objective would be to march his corps directly on the political heart of the nation, Tehran. By threatening the capital, he would force the Revolutionary Guard to emerge from their subterranean fortresses and mountain redoubts to defend the supreme leadership, thereby presenting Napoleon with the massive, open-field engagement he craved. Yet it is precisely here that the brilliance of Napoleon encounters the unforgiving reality of the Iranian strategic landscape. Napoleon's doctrine relied heavily upon the enemy, playing by the rules of conventional, decisive warfare. But the Revolutionary Guard does not fight like the Austrian army at Austerlitz. They fight a fluid, asymmetric war, combining ballistic missiles, lethal drone swarms, cyber capabilities, and a deep network of regional proxies designed specifically to prevent total war and raise the cost of conflict to an unbearable threshold. If Napoleon attempted his lightning strike on Tehran, he would find himself haunted by the ghosts of his greatest failures, the Peninsular War in Spain and the doomed expedition to Egypt. During his occupation of Spain between 1808 and 1814, Napoleon's forces were bled white not by conventional armies, but by the relentless, grinding insurgency of the Spanish populace, the birth of the term guerrilla or little war. The guerrillas forced the French into an unresolvable dilemma, constantly threatening their rear, slaughtering their supply trains, and forcing them to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops just to keep the roads open. In Spain, the poverty of the land meant that a French army of 100,000 men required a foraging area of 105 miles across just to survive. Iran's deserts and arid plateaus would be infinitely more punishing. As Napoleon's armored columns raced toward Tehran, stretching their lines of communication across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, the Revolutionary Guard would unleash their asymmetric doctrine. They would employ the tactics of the innumerable gnats, biting the giant in the front and the rear, exhausting the invaders through a slow and constant war of attrition. The Guard's naval wing would swarm coalition logistics ships in the Persian Gulf with fast attack craft and mines, while their aerospace forces launched precision-guided suicide drones against the exposed supply convoys snaking through the Zagros. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign offers a similarly grim warning. Arriving with 40,000 troops to liberate the Egyptians from the Mamelukes, Napoleon expected a grand, sweeping conquest reminiscent of Alexander the Great. Instead, his fleet was destroyed by the British Navy at the Battle of the Nile, and the Egyptian populace violently revolted against the occupation. The French found themselves cut off, fighting a vicious, alien insurgency far from home in a brutal climate. An American or Allied advance into Iran, driven by the Napoleonic desire for a swift, decisive victory, would likely culminate in an identical tragedy. The invaders might win every tactical engagement, slaughtering conventional Iranian formations with superior air power and armor, but they would eventually find themselves marooned in the vastness of the Iranian plateau, surrounded by a hostile, mobilized populace slowly bleeding to death from 1,000 asymmetric wounds. Act III, Karl von Clausewitz and the Friction of the Modern Absolute. Where Caesar builds and Napoleon strikes, the Prussian general and military philosopher Karl von Clausewitz pauses, steps back, and analyzes the fundamental nature of the conflict itself. Before a single tank tread crosses the border, before the first surveillance drone is launched into the skies over Tehran, Clausewitz demands the answer to the most comprehensive and far-reaching strategic question a statesman or commander can face. What is the political object of this war? For Clausewitz, war is never an independent phenomenon. It is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will, and it remains eternally subordinate to rational policy. He would look with deep skepticism upon any military planner who treats an invasion of Iran merely as an engineering problem to be solved, as Caesar might, or as a tactical puzzle to be shattered, as Napoleon would. Instead, Clausewitz would view the Iranian theater through the lens of his two most enduring and profound concepts: friction and the center of gravity. Clausewitz defined friction as the accumulation of countless small obstacles that distinguish real war from war on paper. He famously noted that while everything in war is simple, the simplest thing is difficult. In the 19th century, friction meant bad weather, lost dispatches, and exhausted horses. In a modern war against Iran, friction takes on a terrifying, multi-dimensional form, amplified by advanced technology and dense urban environments. If a coalition force were to push into Iranian megacities like Kermanshah, Tabriz, or Tehran, they would encounter what military scholars describe as friction expressed in concrete and steel. The physical terrain of a modern city actively resists clean military execution. Streets canalize movement into lethal kill zones, and towering buildings obscure lines of sight, neutralizing the technological superiority of a modern invading force. We have seen this grim reality play out in recent urban battles. During the First Battle of Fallujah in 2004, American forces were pressured into a hasty assault following the horrific ambush of 4 private contractors, whose bodies were burned and hung from a bridge over the Euphrates River. The resulting haste introduced massive friction into the operation. In the Second Battle of Fallujah later that year, the United States military, despite possessing overwhelming firepower, found that every single block was fiercely contested, with insurgents weaponizing the geography to negate coalition advantages. More recently, the 9-month Battle of Mosul between 2016 and 2017 demonstrated the grueling nightmare of modern urban combat against a deeply entrenched adversary. Defending forces utilized subterranean networks to maneuver unseen, employed hundreds of suicide car bombs guided by commercial drones, and used thousands of civilians as human shields. The friction was devastating. In one instance, an armored column advanced to the Tigris River without infantry protection. Insurgents exploited their vulnerable flanks, inflicting over 100 casualties and forcing a desperate rescue by special operations forces and air power. In Mosul, an attacker-to-defender ratio of nearly 30-to-1 was required to secure victory, and the urban warfare consumed 4 times the amount of ammunition used in rural environments, severely depleting strategic stockpiles. Clausewitz would argue that an invasion of Iran would magnify this friction exponentially. The Revolutionary Guard has spent decades preparing for precisely this scenario, constructing vast underground missile cities and bunker complexes designed to survive bunker-busting munitions. Furthermore, modern friction is not merely physical, it is profoundly psychological and informational. In the era of ubiquitous smartphones and global internet access, a single video of a collapsed building or civilian casualties, whether true or fabricated, can instantly shift global public opinion, strain Allied cohesion, and erode the political will required to sustain the war. The fog of war is no longer just a lack of reliable information. It is a blinding blizzard of disinformation, cyber attacks, media theater, and moral ambiguity. To overcome this overwhelming friction, a commander must identify and direct their heaviest blows against the enemy's center of gravity. The modern military defines a center of gravity as a source of power that provides moral or physical strength, freedom of action, or will to act. Clausewitz originally described it more poetically as the hub of all power and movement, on which everything depends. If the political objective of invading Iran is regime change, where does the center of gravity lie? A cursory analysis might point to the supreme leader or the formal clerical apparatus. Planners advocating for a leadership decapitation strategy might argue that targeted strikes to remove the supreme leadership would cause the entire system to collapse. Clausewitz would caution deeply against this simplistic, optimistic view. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a hybrid ideological and security regime. Over the decades, it has evolved, with the true locus of power shifting steadily from the clerical institutions toward the security apparatus, specifically the Revolutionary Guard. The Guard commands the military forces, the asymmetric proxy networks, and vast swaths of the Iranian economy. They are the physical guardians of the state, an undeniable source of physical strength. However, Clausewitz would argue that even the Revolutionary Guard is not the ultimate center of gravity. In a modern, asymmetric conflict, the center of gravity is rarely a fixed physical point, an individual leader, or even a specific army. It is dynamic, psychological, and deeply political. Clausewitz's remarkable trinity dictates that war consists of three distinct forces: primordial violence and hatred representing the people, chance and probability representing the military, and rational policy representing the government. In cities, this trinity collapses into a single, compact, and highly volatile battle space. Clausewitz would identify the true center of gravity in Iran as the ideological resilience of the regime and the popular will to resist foreign occupation. Defeating a leader differs vastly from undermining popular will. History shows that revolutionary regimes often transition into hardened, unforgiving security states when placed under existential pressure. If coalition forces invade Iran, the regime would immediately frame the conflict not as a defense of the government, but as a defense of the Iranian homeland, of Islam, and of the revolution against imperialist aggression. The Ardesh, composed largely of conscripts who might otherwise be sympathetic to domestic protests, would find themselves fighting shoulder to shoulder with the hardliners to repel a foreign invader. Even if coalition forces managed to destroy the Ardesh, shatter the Revolutionary Guard's conventional formations, and occupy Tehran, they would have achieved nothing more than a tactical illusion. If the ideological apparatus survives, and if the populace, driven by the primordial passion of the Clausewitzian Trinity, remains hostile, the occupation will inevitably fail. The invaders would be subjected to a relentless insurgency that weaponizes the sheer size of the country and the depth of its population against them. Clausewitz would look at the immense geographic depth of the Iranian plateau, the systemic fractures of its society, the fanatical devotion of its elite guard, and the brutal, grinding friction of modern urban warfare. Having weighed these elements, he would deliver a stark, unyielding verdict to the statesmen considering an invasion. He would warn them that military victory means nothing if the political will of the adversary is not broken. To march an army into the Zagros Mountains is to invite the destruction of your own military forces, not by a single decisive battle, but by the slow, suffocating weight of geography, insurgency, and infinite friction. In the grand strategy of the modern era, Iran remains the uninvadable fortress, a labyrinth where armies may enter with grand ambitions, but from which victory rarely escapes. Chapter 2: The Island Fortress Securing Kharg Island. Setting the stage. To comprehend the sheer magnitude and the perilous calculus of the modern Persian Gulf conflict, one must direct their focus away from the sprawling capitals of the Middle East and look instead to a minuscule coral outcrop situated in the northern waters of the Gulf. Located a mere 25 kilometers off the southwestern coast of the Iranian mainland, Kharg Island is an unimposing geographic feature. Spanning approximately 20 square kilometers, roughly equivalent in size to the Yongsan district of Seoul, or about one-third the size of the Manhattan borough in New York, the island belies its colossal strategic importance. It is the absolute, undisputed crown jewel of the Iranian oil economy, serving as the primary export terminal through which approximately 90% of the Islamic Republic's crude oil flows to the global market. The financial statistics surrounding this island are staggering, underscoring its role as the economic lifeblood of the nation. The terminal handles operations that generate roughly $78 billion in annual energy revenue. In the year 2025 alone, Kharg Island facilitated $53 billion in net oil export revenue, a figure that accounted for approximately 11% of the nation's entire gross domestic product. However, its value extends far beyond mere national economics. It is the direct funding mechanism for the regime's Marshall Enterprise. The Iranian military apparatus physically takes possession of the oil barrels at the Kharg Island deepwater berths, selling them independently on the global market, predominantly to Eastern powers like China, to finance their operations, their ballistic missile programs, and their regional proxy networks. As international observers have noted, whoever controls Kharg Island controls the financial oxygen of the Iranian regime. For decades, analysts have fixated on the nation's nuclear ambitions and drone capabilities, yet the true, existential vulnerability of the state is not military. It is strictly economic. Recognizing this profound vulnerability, Tehran has transformed Kharg Island into an impregnable fortress, earning it the moniker of the Forbidden Island among the local populace. The island is currently inhabited by roughly 20,000 residents, the vast majority of whom are specialized oil industry workers, alongside thousands of deeply entrenched Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel. Access is strictly limited, and the defensive perimeter is lethal. The surrounding waters are heavily guarded by swarms of fast-attack craft, submarines, and maritime patrols operated by both the Revolutionary Guard Navy and the conventional Army Navy, operating out of the broader Bushehr-Kharg region. In response to the escalating crisis of early 2026, precipitated by a 5-day deadline issued by the United States administration to force peace talks, the island's defenses have been dramatically fortified. Intelligence confirms that Iranian forces have layered the shorelines with intricate networks of coastal minefields, embedding anti-armor and anti-personnel traps along the beaches to obstruct any rapid-response amphibious landings. Moving inland, the island bristles with coastal missile launchers, advanced radar surveillance networks, and a newly deployed echelon of shoulder-fired, surface-to-air guided missile systems, commonly known as man-portable air defense systems. These weapons are specifically positioned to shred low-flying helicopters and tiltrotor aircraft attempting vertical insertions. The strategic tension reached a boiling point following a series of joint United States and Israeli strikes on the 28th of February, and subsequent operations by the United States Central Command on the 13th of March. During the March operation, American forces targeted 90 distinct military sites on the island, obliterating naval mine storage facilities, runways, and missile bunkers. However, the oil infrastructure was deliberately spared, with the administration citing reasons of decency and a desire to avoid an immediate global energy catastrophe. As the conflict deepens, a massive American invasion force has amassed in the region. Nearly 5,000 United States Marine Corps personnel, attached to the 31st and 11th Marine Expeditionary Units, operating from amphibious assault ships like the USS Tripoli, are currently navigating toward the Strait of Hormuz, while roughly 1,000 paratroopers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division prepare for immediate deployment. The prospect of seizing Kharg Island is now the central debate of the war. Taking the island would grant the United States direct control over the destiny of the conflict, guaranteeing freedom of navigation, dictating global energy flows, and bankrupting the Iranian military apparatus overnight. Yet the heavily mined waters and layered air defenses promise a bloody, high-casualty engagement. Conquering such an objective demands unprecedented strategic brilliance. To understand how such an operation might unfold, one must consult the ghosts of military history. If the greatest operational minds were resurrected to command this modern coalition force, how would they approach the seizure of the Forbidden Island? By examining the contrasting doctrines of Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Karl von Clausewitz, three radically different, yet equally compelling, blueprints for modern warfare emerge. Act I: Caesar and the Modern Sea. If command of the American expeditionary forces were handed to Julius Caesar, the Roman general would immediately reject the premise of a direct, hasty amphibious assault against the prepared kill zones of the Kharg Island beaches. Caesar's strategic trademark was his meticulous, engineering-heavy approach to warfare, characterized by immense patience and a willingness to use logistics and earthworks as weapons of mass destruction. To the island would appear not as a beach to be stormed, but as a fortified settlement to be suffocated. His approach would be heavily informed by his defining, brilliant triumph at the Battle of Alesia in 52 before the Common Era, an engagement that stands as a timeless masterclass in siege warfare and military investment. At Alesia, Caesar faced the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, who had consolidated a massive confederation of roughly 80,000 warriors atop a highly defensible plateau. Outnumbered and operating deep within hostile territory, Caesar understood that ordering his legions to charge up the hills into the teeth of the Gallic defenses would result in the annihilation of his army. Instead of fighting on the enemy's terms, Caesar ordered his 55,000 legionnaires to pick up their entrenching tools and construct a sprawling, unprecedented double-walled ring of fortifications around the entire settlement. The inner ring, known in Roman military doctrine as the line of circumvallation, spanned 11 miles in circumference and faced inward toward the town. Its sole purpose was to lock the besieged Gauls inside, cutting off their access to food, water, and escape routes, thereby initiating a slow, agonizing process of starvation. However, Caesar knew that Vercingetorix had dispatched cavalry to summon reinforcements. Anticipating a massive counterattack from the surrounding countryside, Caesar constructed an outer ring, the line of contravallation. This second wall spanned 14 miles and faced outward, designed entirely to protect the besieging Roman army from a Gallic relief force that eventually swelled to an estimated 250,000 men. Between these wooden palisades and 4-meter-high dirt ramparts, Caesar's engineers embedded a terrifying array of lethal traps. They dug deep trenches, planted fields of sharpened wooden stakes, and created checkerboard patterns of camouflaged pits known as lilies, which concealed smaller, lethal spikes. Furthest out, they laid rows of short logs driven into the ground, topped with barbed iron hooks designed to tear through the feet of charging warriors. These traps were not meant to win the battle outright. They were designed to bleed the enemy, slowing their momentum and breaking their physical and psychological cohesion before they ever reached the Roman walls. Transporting this ancient doctrine of dual investment to the 21st century theater of the Persian Gulf, Caesar would look at the 25 kilometers of water separating Kharg Island from the Iranian mainland and see the perfect canvas for a modern maritime double envelopment. Rather than spending the lives of his Marines attempting to breach the anti-armor mines and surface-to-air missiles guarding the shores, Caesar would build an impenetrable, digitized blockade around the island, treating the waters of the Gulf itself as his defensive earthworks. His modern line of circumvallation would be constructed using an invisible, explosive net of advanced naval technologies. Caesar would recognize that the true value of Kharg Island is its ability to export oil. Therefore, stopping the oil is equivalent to taking the island. To achieve this, he would deploy a fleet of autonomous and unmanned systems to cordon off the deepwater berths. The United States Navy's modern arsenal includes sophisticated air-dropped bottom influence mines, which rest silently and invisibly on the seafloor. These advanced munitions detonate only when their sensors detect the specific acoustic or magnetic signatures of an enemy vessel passing overhead, making them the perfect modern equivalent of Caesar's barbed spikes and hidden lilies. By sewing these munitions in a tight, inescapable perimeter around Kharg's port facilities, Caesar creates an immediate, lethal barrier to maritime traffic. To patrol this inner ring and ensure absolute isolation, Caesar would utilize uncrewed surface vehicles equipped with automated sensor suites, such as the Threat Tracker system. Recently tested by the Naval Surface Warfare Center, this rapidly deployable platform is designed to operate continuously on the water, using advanced sensors to identify and intercept unauthorized drones, small fast-attack craft, or intruders attempting to slip through the blockade. Beneath the waves, submersibles operating technologies like the disposable reusable expeditionary warfare underwater vehicle, alongside the semi-autonomous Barracuda mine neutralization system, would be tasked with aggressively hunting and destroying the defensive mines laid by the Iranians. This would clear a secure, tightly controlled corridor solely for the use of American blockade runners, while keeping the defenders permanently boxed in. The psychological and physical goal of this inner line is absolute starvation. No oil leaves the island, and no food, fresh water, ammunition, or reinforcements arrive to sustain the 20,000 residents and the entrenched military personnel. Simultaneously, Caesar would establish his modern line of contravallation. He would be acutely aware that the Iranian military command on the mainland, much like the massive Gallic Relief Army at Alesia, would not sit idle while their economic center of gravity was systematically choked to death. Because the mainland is a mere 25 kilometers away, the risk of a massive, coordinated counterattack from the coastal bases is extreme. To build his outward-facing wall, Caesar would position his naval assets, such as the carrier strike group led by the USS Abraham Lincoln, as floating, heavily armored fortresses in the northern Persian Gulf. Guided missile destroyers and cruisers would form an interlocking, Aegis-equipped missile defense shield, establishing an impenetrable radar and interception dome to protect the blockading fleet from mainland ballistic and cruise missile strikes. To fortify this outer defensive wall and provide early warning, Caesar would demand continuous, overlapping air patrols. Unmanned aerial vehicles, such as Israeli-designed Hermes and Heron drones, operating alongside American MQ-9 Reapers, would loiter endlessly in the stratosphere above the northern Gulf. These high-altitude platforms would provide persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, acting as the modern, digitized equivalent of Caesar's wooden watchtowers spaced along the ramparts. The moment an Iranian fast-attack craft flotilla left the Bushehr naval base to attempt to break the siege, or the moment a coastal missile battery on the mainland powered up its targeting radar, the loitering aircraft would instantly rain down precision-guided munitions, neutralizing the threat before it could threaten the blockade line. Caesar's genius at Alesia was his profound patience, and his understanding that time, when paired with superior engineering, is the deadliest weapon in a commander's arsenal. By applying a modern, technologically driven blockade, Caesar fundamentally avoids the immense friction and high casualties of a direct, bloody assault on the heavily trapped beaches of Kharg Island. He successfully halts the export of 90% of Iran's crude oil without firing a single kinetic shot at the highly valuable, delicate oil infrastructure itself, thereby preserving the physical pipelines and storage tanks for future Allied use. Caesar simply waits, protected by his dual walls of sensors, mines, and interceptors, until the defenders on Kharg Island, entirely stripped of supplies, hope, and strategic utility, are forced to surrender their impenetrable fortress without the besiegers ever setting foot on the sand. Act II, Napoleon and overwhelming firepower. If Julius Caesar's approach to taking Kharg Island is defined by patient, methodical, and engineering-driven strangulation, the strategy of Napoleon Bonaparte is defined by unprecedented, apocalyptic violence and blinding speed. Napoleon would view a protracted, multi-week siege of the island as a dangerous, unacceptable squandering of operational momentum. To the French emperor, the essence of warfare was about shock, rapid maneuver, and the massing of overwhelming, concentrated offensive firepower at the enemy's weakest, yet most critical geometric point. Napoleon single-handedly revolutionized European warfare by fundamentally challenging the conventional 18th-century paradigm of dispersed, linear artillery. Prior to his ascension, military commanders routinely scattered their cannons thinly amidst the ranks of infantry, using them primarily for defensive counter-battery fire against enemy guns. Napoleon, heavily influenced by the mobility of the newly developed Greibeval artillery system and the offensive theories of military thinker Jean Dutelle, transformed artillery from an ancillary support branch into a co-equal, decisive arm of combat. His signature tactical innovation was the Grand Battery, the assembling of dozens, and sometimes hundreds, of cannons into a single, massive formation directed at a specific, localized point on the battlefield. At legendary engagements like the Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of Wagram, and the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon utilized these grand batteries to deliver devastating, concentrated barrages. The objective of this massed fire was not merely to cause incremental attrition. It was to shatter the enemy's physical lines, inflict catastrophic casualties in a matter of minutes, and completely break the equilibrium of the battle. Once the enemy was softened, disoriented, and paralyzed by this concentrated bombardment, Napoleon would immediately unleash his shock forces, heavily armored cuirassiers, and tightly packed columns of elite infantry to plunge into the newly created breach, exploiting the chaos and decisively ending the engagement before the enemy could recover their senses. Looking at the formidable defenses of Kharg Island in the modern era, Napoleon would immediately recognize the operational challenge. The shorelines are heavily mined with anti-armor traps, and the interior is heavily studded with sophisticated air defense networks and shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. His solution would not be a blockade, but the creation of a modern, digitized grand battery. The emperor would translate his massed bronze cannons into a synchronized, multi-domain barrage of cruise missiles, heavy bomber payloads, and naval gunfire, executed with a brutal mathematical precision that perfectly mirrors the modern salvo combat model. The salvo equations, a staple of modern naval combat theory developed by maritime strategists like Wayne Hughes, dictate that victory in contemporary missile combat requires launching a volume of offensive firepower that completely and instantaneously overwhelms both the enemy's defensive interception capabilities and the staying power of their platforms. Napoleon would fully embrace this modern doctrine of saturation. He would flatly reject the concept of a slow, calibrated, tit-for-tat exchange of fire. Instead, he would orchestrate a simultaneous, overwhelming strike designed to mentally, physically, and electronically crush the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps defenders in a matter of hours. The bombardment would begin from beyond the visual horizon, entirely out of range of the island's conventional retaliatory systems. Strategic bombers like the B-52, heavily armed F-A-18 strike fighters launching from the flight decks of the USS Abraham Lincoln, and a submerged fleet of guided missile submarines would unleash a saturated, perfectly timed wave of standoff munitions. Napoleon's prioritized targets would be the cognitive and defensive organs of the island. The command and control nodes, the radar installations, the coastal anti-ship missile launchers, and the newly deployed stockpiles of man-portable air defense systems. Drawing on the precedent of previous Central Command operations, where 90 targets including mine storage facilities and bunkers were hit in a single, sweeping surgical strike, Napoleon would expand this operational template tenfold. The sky above Kharg Island would be literally blotted out by Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles and precision-guided glide bombs. The Grand Battery of the 21st century would systematically dismantle the island's layered defenses, pounding the infrastructure until organized military resistance became a physical and psychological impossibility. Crucially, for Napoleon, the artillery barrage is never the end of the battle. It is merely the violent prologue to the infantry assault. Once the equilibrium of the island's defense was irrevocably broken by the missile salvo, Napoleon would immediately unleash his modern shock troops. In his era, this decisive role was played by the heavy cavalry and the fiercely loyal veterans of the Imperial Guard. In the modern theater of the Persian Gulf, this role is fulfilled by the highly trained, combined arms forces of the Marine Expeditionary Units and airborne infantry. While the dust and smoke from the bombardment still hung thick in the air, blinding the surviving defenders, thousands of Marines from the 31st and 11th Marine Expeditionary Units would launch from the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli. Because the shorelines of Kharg Island are known to be heavily laced with anti-armor and anti-personnel mines, Napoleon would utilize the modern, highly aggressive tactic of vertical envelopment. Rather than wading slowly through the surf into a prepared, sighted kill zone, waves of heavy transport helicopters and rapid tiltrotor aircraft would bypass the treacherous beaches entirely. They would execute a rapid ship-to-objective maneuver, dropping highly trained shock troops directly onto the island's critical infrastructure hubs, captured airfields, and smoking command centers. Simultaneously, 1,000 paratroopers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division would descend from the sky, fracturing the remaining, disorganized enemy formations from within and preventing any coherent defensive perimeter from forming. This entire sequence is the ultimate manifestation of agility and shock warfare, ramming elite maneuver forces deep into the vulnerabilities artificially created by overwhelming operational fires. Napoleon would not afford the Iranian forces a single moment to regroup, repair their severed communications, or coordinate a counterattack from the mainland bases. By radically compressing the timeline of violence, he minimizes the period in which his assault forces are exposed to danger. The sheer speed, mass, and unbridled ferocity of the combined arms assault would totally overwhelm the defender's cognitive ability to react. For Napoleon Bonaparte, the seizure of Kharg Island would not be a protracted, calculated siege. It would be a sudden, violent thunderclap that leaves the United States flag flying firmly over the captured economic heart of the enemy before the world even realizes the battle has begun. Act III, Clausewitz and the cost of the prize. While Caesar and Napoleon might view the capture of Kharg Island as a magnificent tactical puzzle to be solved through either superior engineering or overwhelming firepower, the Prussian philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, would view the entire enterprise through a deeply skeptical, highly strategic lens. For Clausewitz, war is never an isolated exercise in military geometry or tactical prowess. It is an organic, chaotic, and inherently unpredictable extension of political policy. If tasked with planning the invasion of Kharg Island, Clausewitz would not begin his analysis by asking how to physically take the island, but rather by asking a much more profound question. Why does taking this island serve the ultimate political objective of the state, and at what terrible cost will this prize ultimately be won? In his foundational assessments, Clausewitz would undoubtedly identify Kharg Island as the Iranian state's center of gravity. This concept, which Clausewitz originally derived from the mechanical sciences and the physics theories of Paul Ehrman, describes the point of balance where forces converge. In physics, striking an object's center of gravity causes it to lose its equilibrium and collapse entirely. Applied to military strategy, the center of gravity is the focal point of unity and interdependence within an enemy's system, the source of strength that provides them with freedom of action and the will to fight. In the context of the Persian Gulf conflict, Kharg Island is the undisputed economic center of gravity for the Iranian regime. It is the primary mechanism that funds the military apparatus, sustains the national economy, and ensures the domestic survival of the government. From a pure, sterile targeting perspective, favored by modern air power theorists, seizing or destroying the island appears to be the most logical, decisive stroke to force a swift political capitulation. However, Clausewitz is most famous for introducing the concept of friction to military theory, the profound, terrifying, and omnipresent difference between war as it is planned on paper and war as it is actually fought in reality. Friction is the hindering medium of combat, the atmospheric haze composed of extreme physical danger, exhaustion, unpredictable weather, mechanical equipment failure, and inevitable human error that makes even the simplest military maneuvers excruciatingly difficult to execute. As Clausewitz famously noted, everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. When Clausewitz looks at the prospect of a massive amphibious or airborne assault on Kharg Island, he sees a scenario that is overwhelmingly saturated with operational friction. Amphibious operations are historically acknowledged as among the most complex, delicate, and inherently dangerous military endeavors ever conceived by planners. The coordination required to perfectly synchronize naval gunfire from destroyers, close air support from loitering drones, mine-clearing operations by submersibles, and successive waves of vulnerable landing craft and transport helicopters is monumental. Clausewitz would scrutinize Napoleon's brilliant timeline and ask devastating questions based on the reality of friction. What happens when an automated underwater vehicle fails to detect a cluster of advanced bottom influence mines, and a United States Navy transport ship carrying hundreds of Marines is crippled in the shallow littoral waters? What happens to the flawless vertical envelopment when a single, surviving Revolutionary Guard defender, hidden in the coral outcroppings, successfully uses a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile to down a heavy transport helicopter carrying dozens of American paratroopers? The reality of friction means that casualties in such operations are rarely as low as the headquarters planners project. Intelligence reports already indicate that Washington's regional Gulf allies have privately urged the administration against a ground operation, precisely because the layered, overlapping defenses practically guarantee heavy American casualties. More importantly, beyond the immediate tactical friction of the assault, Clausewitz would rigorously analyze the strategic concept of the culminating point of victory. This is the critical, highly dangerous moment in any military campaign when an attacking force has overextended itself, depleting its momentum, its physical resources, and its logistical tether to the point where it loses the operational initiative and becomes highly vulnerable to a devastating enemy counterattack. If the United States military successfully pays the blood price and seizes Kharg Island, does that tactical victory actually force Iran to the negotiating table? Or does it merely mark the culminating point where the American military becomes disastrously overextended? Clausewitz would argue that planting the flag on Kharg Island might actually be a massive strategic trap. Once the island is captured, the occupying Marines and paratroopers instantly transition from a mobile strike force into a static, easily identifiable target, stranded on a 20-square-kilometer rock a mere 25 kilometers from a highly hostile Iranian mainland. To keep these troops alive, the United States Navy would be forced to maintain a permanent, massive armada in the confined, highly dangerous, and easily targeted waters of the northern Persian Gulf, simply to resupply, rotate, and defend the occupying force. This reality dramatically stretches American logistical supply lines to their absolute breaking point, permanently tying down highly valuable carrier strike groups and amphibious readiness groups that are desperately needed to project power in other critical global theaters, thereby perfectly fulfilling the definition of a culminating point. Furthermore, Clausewitz would deeply assess the broader political, economic, and global friction triggered by the island's capture. The Iranian war strategy operates on a publicly declared doctrine of unbridled, horizontal escalation. Recognizing that their economic center of gravity has been compromised or occupied, Tehran would not quietly surrender or sue for peace. Instead, they would immediately seek to impose enormous, unacceptable costs on the global economy and regional stability to restore their shattered deterrence. The Islamic Republic has explicitly threatened to retaliate against any attack on its vital oil infrastructure by launching massive, unrestricted drone and ballistic missile barrages against the fragile energy facilities of neighboring, pro-Western Arab states, such as the United Arab Emirates and Oman. Furthermore, they would likely accelerate their asymmetric naval efforts, using fast attack craft and naval mines to physically choke off the Strait of Hormuz, a critical maritime choke point through which 20% of the world's daily oil supply must pass. The successful seizure of Kharg Island would, therefore, instantly spark a catastrophic global energy crisis. Oil prices, already hovering above $100 per barrel due to the initial conflict, would skyrocket uncontrollably, causing the largest, most severe supply disruption in the history of the global oil market and triggering deep, destabilizing economic recessions across the Western world. By taking the enemy's economic center of gravity, the United States might inadvertently destroy its own economic stability and alienate its global allies. Therefore, Clausewitz would look upon the meticulously detailed siege plans of Caesar and the explosive, shock-and-awe assault charts of Napoleon with profound, enduring caution. He would force the High Command to answer a sobering, ultimate question. Is the total destruction of the enemy's economy worth the highly probable ignition of a wider, uncontrollable regional war and a devastating global financial collapse? Clausewitz would weigh the staggering tactical friction of the amphibious landing, the extreme vulnerability of reaching the culmination point on a tiny island, and the catastrophic ripple effects of horizontal escalation, and he would likely conclude that Kharg Island is a prize far too costly to hold. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of grand strategy, identifying the enemy's heart is an entirely different matter from surviving the act of tearing it out. Act III, Clausewitz and the cost of the prize. While Caesar and Napoleon might view the capture of Kharg Island as a magnificent tactical puzzle to be solved through either superior engineering or overwhelming firepower, the Prussian philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, would view the entire enterprise through a deeply skeptical, highly strategic lens. For Clausewitz, war is never an isolated exercise in military geometry or tactical prowess. It is an organic, chaotic, and inherently unpredictable extension of political policy. If tasked with planning the invasion of Kharg Island, Clausewitz would not begin his analysis by asking how to physically take the island, but rather by asking a much more profound question. Why does taking this island serve the ultimate political objective of the state, and at what terrible cost will this prize ultimately be won? In his foundational assessments, Clausewitz would undoubtedly identify Kharg Island as the Iranian state's center of gravity. This concept, which Clausewitz originally derived from the mechanical sciences and the physics theories of Paul Ehrman, describes the point of balance where forces converge. In physics, striking an object's center of gravity causes it to lose its equilibrium and collapse entirely. Applied to military strategy, the center of gravity is the focal point of unity and interdependence within an enemy's system, the source of strength that provides them with freedom of action and the will to fight. In the context of the Persian Gulf conflict, Kharg Island is the undisputed economic center of gravity for the Iranian regime. It is the primary mechanism that funds the military apparatus, sustains the national economy, and ensures the domestic survival of the government. From a pure, sterile targeting perspective, favored by modern air power theorists, seizing or destroying the island appears to be the most logical, decisive stroke to force a swift political capitulation. However, Clausewitz is most famous for introducing the concept of friction to military theory, the profound, terrifying, and omnipresent difference between war as it is planned on paper and war as it is actually fought in reality. Friction is the hindering medium of combat, the atmospheric haze composed of extreme physical danger, exhaustion, unpredictable weather, mechanical equipment failure, and inevitable human error that makes even the simplest military maneuvers excruciatingly difficult to execute. As Clausewitz famously noted, everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. When Clausewitz looks at the prospect of a massive amphibious or airborne assault on Kharg Island, he sees a scenario that is overwhelmingly saturated with operational friction. Amphibious operations are historically acknowledged as among the most complex, delicate, and inherently dangerous military endeavors ever conceived by planners. The coordination required to perfectly synchronize naval gunfire from destroyers, close air support from loitering drones, mine-clearing operations by submersibles, and successive waves of vulnerable landing craft and transport helicopters is monumental. Clausewitz would scrutinize Napoleon's brilliant timeline and ask devastating questions based on the reality of friction. What happens when an automated underwater vehicle fails to detect a cluster of advanced bottom influence mines, and a United States Navy transport ship carrying hundreds of Marines is crippled in the shallow littoral waters? What happens to the flawless vertical envelopment when a single, surviving Revolutionary Guard defender, hidden in the coral outcroppings, successfully uses a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile to down a heavy transport helicopter carrying dozens of American paratroopers? The reality of friction means that casualties in such operations are rarely as low as the headquarters planners project. Intelligence reports already indicate that Washington's regional Gulf allies have privately urged the administration against a ground operation, precisely because the layered, overlapping defenses practically guarantee heavy American casualties. More importantly, beyond the immediate tactical friction of the assault, Clausewitz would rigorously analyze the strategic concept of the culminating point of victory. This is the critical, highly dangerous moment in any military campaign when an attacking force has overextended itself, depleting its momentum, its physical resources, and its logistical tether to the point where it loses the operational initiative and becomes highly vulnerable to a devastating enemy counterattack. If the United States military successfully pays the blood price and seizes Kharg Island, does that tactical victory actually force Iran to the negotiating table? Or does it merely mark the culminating point where the American military becomes disastrously overextended? Clausewitz would argue that planting the flag on Kharg Island might actually be a massive strategic trap. Once the island is captured, the occupying Marines and paratroopers instantly transition from a mobile strike force into a static, easily identifiable target, stranded on a 20-square-kilometer rock a mere 25 kilometers from a highly hostile Iranian mainland. To keep these troops alive, the United States Navy would be forced to maintain a permanent, massive armada in the confined, highly dangerous, and easily targeted waters of the northern Persian Gulf, simply to resupply, rotate, and defend the occupying force. This reality dramatically stretches American logistical supply lines to their absolute breaking point, permanently tying down highly valuable carrier strike groups and amphibious readiness groups that are desperately needed to project power in other critical global theaters, thereby perfectly fulfilling the definition of a culminating point. Furthermore, Clausewitz would deeply assess the broader political, economic, and global friction triggered by the island's capture. The Iranian war strategy operates on a publicly declared doctrine of unbridled, horizontal escalation. Recognizing that their economic center of gravity has been compromised or occupied, Tehran would not quietly surrender or sue for peace. Instead, they would immediately seek to impose enormous, unacceptable costs on the global economy and regional stability to restore their shattered deterrence. The Islamic Republic has explicitly threatened to retaliate against any attack on its vital oil infrastructure by launching massive, unrestricted drone and ballistic missile barrages against the fragile energy facilities of neighboring, pro-Western Arab states, such as the United Arab Emirates and Oman. Furthermore, they would likely accelerate their asymmetric naval efforts, using fast attack craft and naval mines to physically choke off the Strait of Hormuz, a critical maritime choke point through which 20% of the world's daily oil supply must pass. The successful seizure of Kharg Island would, therefore, instantly spark a catastrophic global energy crisis. Oil prices, already hovering above $100 per barrel due to the initial conflict, would skyrocket uncontrollably, causing the largest, most severe supply disruption in the history of the global oil market and triggering deep, destabilizing economic recessions across the Western world. By taking the enemy's economic center of gravity, the United States might inadvertently destroy its own economic stability and alienate its global allies. Therefore, Clausewitz would look upon the meticulously detailed siege plans of Caesar and the explosive, shock-and-awe assault charts of Napoleon with profound, enduring caution. He would force the High Command to answer a sobering, ultimate question. Is the total destruction of the enemy's economy worth the highly probable ignition of a wider, uncontrollable regional war and a devastating global financial collapse? Clausewitz would weigh the staggering tactical friction of the amphibious landing, the extreme vulnerability of reaching the culmination point on a tiny island, and the catastrophic ripple effects of horizontal escalation, and he would likely conclude that Kharg Island is a prize far too costly to hold. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of grand strategy, identifying the enemy's heart is an entirely different matter from surviving the act of tearing it out. Act II, Napoleon the Continental System Reborn. If Caesar viewed the Strait of Hormuz as a physical fortress to be breached and conquered by infantry, Napoleon Bonaparte would look at the exact same body of water and see an entirely different battlefield. Napoleon would view the strait not merely as a military target, but as the ultimate instrument of global economic warfare. To fully understand Napoleon's approach to global maritime chokepoints, one must look to the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Following the total destruction of the combined Franco-Spanish fleet by the British Royal Navy under the command of Admiral Nelson, Napoleon recognized an unassailable truth. An amphibious invasion of the British Isles was a logistical impossibility. He could not decisively defeat the British at sea. Therefore, he decided to defeat them through their ledger books, targeting their status as a vast nation of shopkeepers. In 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, which was rapidly followed by the Milan Decree in 1807, thereby establishing the infamous Continental System. This grand strategic maneuver was a massive, continent-wide economic embargo, explicitly designed to paralyze the British economy by entirely cutting off its access to all European markets. All nations allied with or subjugated by the French Empire were strictly forbidden from importing British goods, and any neutral ship that dared to stop at a British port or pay British tariffs was immediately declared a lawful prize of war by the French Navy. Napoleon firmly believed that by destroying Britain's commercial trade, he could trigger rampant inflation, cause the collapse of its highly leveraged financial system, and strip London of the immense wealth required to fund the various military coalitions continuously arrayed against France. Approach: weaponizing the flow of oil. Transporting the ruthless logic of the Continental System to a modern conflict involving Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, Napoleon would immediately recognize that the 20 million barrels of oil flowing through the chokepoint each day is the exact modern equivalent of 19th-century British manufacturing exports. In this scenario, Napoleon would not necessarily rush to clear the strait of Iranian mines and midget submarines through a massive military undertaking. Instead, if he were in a position of supreme power, either advising the blockading force or managing the crisis from the outside, he would seek to manipulate the closure of the strait to fracture adversarial coalitions and bend neutral nations to his absolute political will. The geopolitical leverage provided by the Strait of Hormuz is staggering. Over 80% of the crude oil and liquefied natural gas that transits the strait is destined for highly dependent Asian markets. China imports immense quantities of crude through this corridor, while nations like India, Japan, and South Korea are existentially dependent on these energy flows to power their vast industrial economies and sustain their agricultural sectors. For India, a prolonged closure threatens catastrophic fertilizer shortages right before the critical monsoon season, as liquefied natural gas is a primary, irreplaceable input for massive urea production. Napoleon would weaponize this global desperation. Just as he used the Continental System to force neutral European countries to choose sides, he would use the essential flow of oil to dictate global diplomacy. If he controlled the military forces capable of opening, closing, or metering the strait, he would offer safe passage only to those nations that formally allied with his grand coalition. In 1807, the brutal economic pressure of the British Orders in Council, combined with the French decrees, forced the neutral United States into passing the devastating Embargo Act, causing severe domestic economic pain in a failed attempt to maintain neutrality. In a modern Hormuz crisis, Napoleon would intentionally engineer a global energy shock to force neutral Asian and European powers to abandon any diplomatic or financial support for his enemies. He would brutally decree that any nation continuing to trade with the adversary would be permanently cut off from the secure shipping lanes, essentially starving their economies of energy until they fully capitulated to his demands. The Shadow Fleet and the limits of control. However, Napoleon's historical continental system was fundamentally flawed by the unyielding realities of human greed and the highly porous nature of global trade networks. Because the embargo artificially inflated the price of highly desired goods, a massive black market rapidly emerged. Smuggling became a highly lucrative, continent-wide enterprise, often facilitated by corrupt French customs officials who accepted bribes to look the other way. To completely bypass the system, merchants utilized neutral ports and forged highly sophisticated documents known as certificates of origin to successfully disguise British goods as neutral cargo. In the modern context of a heavily blockaded Strait of Hormuz, Napoleon would face the exact same economic phenomenon: the rapid rise of the maritime shadow fleet. Just as 19th-century merchants forged paperwork in the Azores or Gothenburg to evade French patrols, modern energy traders utilize falsified certificates of origin to disguise sanctioned or blockaded crude oil. Massive tankers engage in clandestine ship-to-ship transfers in the open ocean, completely disabling their automatic identification systems to obscure the true source and destination of their cargo. Napoleon, undeterred, would deploy modern financial investigators, satellite tracking, and aggressive naval patrols to ruthlessly hunt down this shadow fleet, treating any vessel with manipulated tracking data or fabricated paperwork as an active enemy combatant engaged in economic warfare against his empire. Imperial overreach, the cold mathematics of history. Yet the greatest, most tragic lesson of the continental system is the extreme danger of imperial overreach. The massive economic damage inflicted by the blockade did not just hurt Britain. It severely damaged the domestic economies of France's own allies and client states. Shipbuilding declined precipitously, coastal regions suffered intense poverty, and resentment against French hegemony boiled over into open rebellion. When Portugal refused to enforce the embargo because its economy depended on British trade, it sparked the brutal, bleeding ulcer of the Peninsular War. When Tsar Alexander I of Russia withdrew from the continental system in 1810 because it was single-handedly destroying the Russian export economy, Napoleon was forced into his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, a catastrophic, prideful decision that ultimately led to his total downfall. Applying this profound historical lesson to Hormuz, a Napoleonic strategy of using the strait for absolute economic blackmail carries extreme existential risk. Attempting to hold 20% of the world's daily oil consumption hostage to force political alignments would likely cause such catastrophic global inflation and industrial collapse that it would unite the entire world against the blockader. The economic blowback would devastate the allies of the blockading force just as severely as the intended targets. Napoleon would view the Strait of Hormuz as the ultimate, unparalleled economic weapon, but the cold mathematics of history dictate that such a weapon is almost impossible to perfectly control, and its prolonged, arrogant use inevitably destroys the empire that wields it. Act III, Clausewitz. Focus the global will to fight. If Caesar provides the tactical blueprint for physical conquest, and Napoleon provides the grand framework for economic warfare. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz provides the profound philosophical lens required to truly understand the immense complexities of a modern war in the Strait of Hormuz. Clausewitz famously defined war not as an isolated act of violence, but as a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means. To Clausewitz, war is a deeply complex, nonlinear adaptive system governed by what he termed the paradoxical trinity. This trinity consists of three perpetually interacting forces. The first is primordial violence, hatred, and enmity, which is typically associated with the raw passions of the people. The second is the play of chance, probability, and friction, which is the exclusive domain of the military commander and the army operating in the field. The third is the element of subordination as a rational instrument of policy, which is the realm of the government and political reason. Clausewitz argued that any theory of war that ignores any one of these three elements, or attempts to fix an arbitrary relationship between them, would conflict violently with reality and become totally useless. When analyzing a potential conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, Clausewitz would immediately identify the region as an environment where the delicate balance of the Trinity is under extreme, perhaps unprecedented, threat. A military operation to clear the strait of Iranian anti-access and area denial systems might begin as a highly rational, carefully calculated instrument of government policy aimed at stabilizing global markets. However, the sheer proximity of opposing forces, the immense strategic stakes involving global energy security, and the deep-seated historical enmities of the Middle East guarantee that the irrational passions of the people and the utterly unpredictable nature of chance will rapidly usurp rational policy. Approach: movement in a hindering medium. Clausewitz's most enduring and profoundly accurate contribution to military theory is his concept of friction, which he elegantly described as the force that makes the apparently easy so exceptionally difficult. Friction is the vast gulf between war on paper and war, as it actually is. It encompasses the fog of war, the inherent, inescapable uncertainty regarding enemy capabilities, true intent, and one's own situational awareness, as well as the physical exhaustion of troops, unexpected weather patterns, and the sudden failure of complex machinery. Clausewitz noted that action in war is movement in a hindering medium, much like walking in water, is immensely more difficult than walking on dry land. The Strait of Hormuz is the absolute geographical embodiment of Clausewitzian friction. It is a highly congested, intensely complex maritime environment where the simplest naval operations become monumentally difficult. The shallow depths of the strait, combined with the continuous roar of massive commercial oil tankers and the industrial noise of extensive offshore drilling rigs, create a highly chaotic acoustic environment. This underwater fog of war severely degrades the sonar capabilities of advanced guided missile destroyers, allowing Iran's tiny, 120-ton Ghadir-class midget submarines to operate with near impunity, slipping entirely undetected through the acoustic shadows to lay mines or launch devastating torpedo strikes. Furthermore, the integration of thousands of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fast attack speedboats, unmanned explosive surface vessels, and highly coordinated swarms of shod loitering munitions introduces a terrifying level of tactical complexity. In a live combat scenario, naval commanders would be immediately inundated with an overwhelming volume of sensory data, forced to instantly distinguish between civilian dhows, friendly escorts, and incoming suicide craft. This intense information overload vastly exacerbates the fog of war, creating a scenario where split-second, life-or-death decisions must be made in a haze of greater or lesser uncertainty, precisely as Clausewitz warned. Clausewitz would also point out that in the modern, hyperconnected era, friction is not strictly limited to the physical battlefield. It extends rapidly into the global economic system. The mere threat of violence in the strait generates immediate, systemic friction through global insurance markets. Before a single ship is struck by a missile, major marine war risk underwriters can abruptly cancel coverage or increase premiums by hundreds of %, instantly forcing the world's largest logistics carriers to suspend cargo acceptance across the entire region. This cascading economic failure is a modern form of applied friction, where a localized military action immediately reverberates into energy shortages in Europe and massive inflation in Asia, proving that in a highly interconnected world, the consequences of war absolutely cannot be contained to the tactical level. The danger of escalation and the rise to extremes. Clausewitz astutely observed that war contains an inherent, logical tendency toward total escalation. Because each belligerent naturally attempts to dictate the terms of the conflict and overcome the violent resistance of the other, there is a natural push toward a dramatic rise to extremes. In the context of the Strait of Hormuz, Clausewitz would issue a dire warning that the operational necessity of clearing the waterway carries catastrophic risks of uncontrollable geopolitical escalation. If a coalition force attempts to reopen the strait by systematically neutralizing Iranian missile batteries and drone bases along the coastline of Keshem Island and Bandar Abbas, they are no longer fighting a localized, contained maritime skirmish. They are conducting direct, sustained strikes on the sovereign territory of a heavily armed, highly motivated regional power. The nonlinearity of war dictates that a system is highly sensitive to initial conditions. A localized strike to protect shipping lanes can easily and rapidly trigger severe horizontal and vertical escalation. Iran has repeatedly and explicitly signaled its willingness to respond asymmetrically, leveraging its extensive axis of resistance proxies across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen to strike coalition bases and critical allied infrastructure across the entire Middle East. Moreover, Clausewitz would focus intently on the profound danger of superpower involvement. The global economic reliance on the 20 million barrels of oil flowing through Hormuz guarantees that major world powers cannot simply remain indifferent observers. China, which imports a massive percentage of its vital energy through the strait, along with Russia and the United States, all possess existential strategic interests in the region. A kinetic conflict in this narrow corridor inherently risks drawing these heavily armed superpowers into a direct, potentially nuclear, standoff. Clausewitz would argue that as the scale of the conflict inevitably expands, the original, highly rational political objective, securing the safe passage of commercial shipping, becomes dangerously and permanently decoupled from the horrific military reality on the ground. The war would aggressively mutate from a limited police operation into a vast struggle for global hegemony, fraught with the unimaginable dangers of nuclear friction and superpower brinkmanship. To Clausewitz, the ultimate, most difficult test of statecraft and military command is maintaining the strict subordination of the violent military effort to the rational political object. He would caution that while unlocking the Strait of Hormuz is a clear, undeniable economic necessity for the globe, the severe friction of the maritime environment, the lethal complexity of the Iranian asymmetric arsenal, and the inevitable spiral of regional escalation make it one of the most dangerous military undertakings in human history. To fight in the strait is to risk losing control of the war entirely. Synthesis, the ultimate strategic challenge. The Strait of Hormuz represents the absolute pinnacle of modern strategic complexity, a 21-mile-wide choke point where ancient geography, fragile global economics, and cutting-edge asymmetric military technology violently collide. Viewed through the lenses of history's greatest military minds, the crisis reveals entirely different, yet deeply interlocking, dimensions of warfare. Caesar would recognize the maritime environment as fundamentally hostile and relentlessly advocate for the total physical conquest of the surrounding geography, demanding the brutal occupation of the Musendam Peninsula and the Iranian coastline to systematically dismantle the enemy's coastal fortresses from the land. Napoleon would see the physical waterway merely as a vulnerable conduit for global wealth, viewing the restriction of 20 million barrels of oil per day as the ultimate weapon of economic coercion to shatter adversarial alliances and force neutral nations into total submission, despite the inherent, historically proven risks of imperial overreach and global economic blowback. Finally, Clausewitz would synthesize these disparate views by identifying the strait as a terrifying cauldron of friction, fog, and unpredictability. He would fully acknowledge the necessity of both decisive military force and grand economic strategy, but he would issue a profound warning. The density of the threats, from midget submarines hidden in acoustic shadows to the blind panic of global insurance markets, guarantees that any conflict will be highly chaotic. More importantly, he would caution that the vast strategic gravity of the strait makes it a volatile powder keg for rapid, uncontrollable escalation, threatening to drag global superpowers into a conflict that easily eclipses the original political objectives. Ultimately, unlocking the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a matter of naval supremacy or technological overmatch. It is an agonizing, high-stakes test of political will, economic endurance, and the absolute mastery of the fog of war. Conclusion. The synthesis. As we look out over the shimmering, volatile waters of the Persian Gulf, the ghosts of our three grand strategists stand beside us. We have asked Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Karl von Clausewitz to gaze upon a modern conflict with Iran. We have asked them to evaluate the narrow, crowded choke point of the Strait of Hormuz and the vital economic prize of Kharg Island. What we have found is that time changes the weapons, but it does not change the fundamental nature of war. Julius Caesar looks at the Iranian theater and sees a profound problem of engineering, logistics, and methodical control. For Caesar, the Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is a modern siege line, a grander version of the walls he built at Alesia. He understands that holding this maritime choke point requires an ironclad logistical network. Caesar would not rush into a messy, unpredictable skirmish. Instead, he would build the physical and digital infrastructure needed to secure the perimeter. He would rely on satellite surveillance, cyber supremacy, and regional alliances to slowly starve the adversary's resources, all while ensuring his own forces are flawlessly supplied. His war is one of systematic strangulation, won by the quartermaster and the engineer long before the first missile is ever fired. Napoleon Bonaparte views the exact same map with an entirely different fire. Where Caesar sees a methodical siege, Napoleon sees the opportunity for a massive, shattering blow. His eyes lock immediately on Kharg Island. To Napoleon, this island is the enemy's center of gravity. It is the economic heart that pumps oil and revenue into the Iranian war machine. He has absolutely no patience for a prolonged, expensive blockade in the strait. Napoleon advocates for speed, shock, and overwhelming localized force. He would launch an audacious, lightning-fast assault to seize or obliterate Kharg Island, aiming to destroy the enemy's will and capacity to fight in a single, decisive stroke. For him, victory is not found in waiting. It is found in the relentless, uncompromising offensive. Then stands Karl von Clausewitz, shaking his head at both the engineer and the conqueror. Clausewitz looks past the warships in the strait and the oil terminals on Kharg Island, staring straight into the halls of government in Tehran, Washington, and capitals around the world. He reminds us that all of this, the blockades, the airstrikes, the naval clashes, is merely politics continued by other means. Clausewitz warns of the immense, unpredictable friction in the Persian Gulf. A sunken tanker, a miscalculated drone strike, or a sudden spike in global energy prices can completely alter the political reality overnight. He demands that we constantly ask one question: what is the actual political objective? For Clausewitz, a brilliant tactical victory by Napoleon on Kharg Island is worse than useless if it sparks a wider regional war that destroys our own long-term political goals. The verdict. So, we arrive at the ultimate question. Which of these three minds offers the most robust, reliable framework for navigating a modern conflict in the Middle East? Who is right? The verdict is that no single philosophy survives contact with the Persian Gulf intact. Relying solely on Caesar risks a forever war of attrition, an endless drain of blood and treasure in a hostile environment. Relying only on Napoleon courts a catastrophic escalation, trading a quick tactical win for a long-term strategic disaster. And leaning exclusively on Clausewitz can lead to a paralysis of analysis, where political caution prevents the very military action necessary to protect national interests. The true answer lies in a ruthless synthesis of all three. A successful campaign in this incredibly complex theater requires a specific hybrid of their genius. To win, a modern commander must first possess the logistical mastery of Julius Caesar. You cannot project power into the Strait of Hormuz without an unshakable foundation of supply, intelligence, and endurance. You must own the battle space before you fight in it. However, when the moment comes to strike, you must channel the tactical aggression of Napoleon. The seizure or neutralization of key assets cannot be done timidly. It requires speed, overwhelming force, and the audacity to break the enemy's balance before they can react. But enveloping both the logistical preparation and the lightning strike must be the profound political sobriety of Clausewitz. Every ship moved, every target locked, and every barrel of oil disrupted must be directly tied to a clear, achievable political end state. War is a violent instrument of policy, and in a powder keg like the Persian Gulf, losing sight of the politics means losing the war. In the end, the ultimate victor in a modern conflict will not be the one who perfectly mimics a single ghost of the past. It will be the commander who can build like Caesar, strike like Napoleon, and think like Clausewitz.